Chapter 7, Thinking and Intelligence. In this audio PowerPoint, we are only going to be covering the intelligence portion of the chapter, and that's what you'll need to know for the quiz and also the exam. I've included in this week's folder, in the handouts portion, a copy of an old 1950s intelligence test to give you an idea of what they used to do for intelligence testing versus what we'll talk about in this audio PowerPoint, what we use for today's intelligence testing. This is one of the sheets of that test that I've included in this week's folder. Now, this was a test that was put out in 1950. There are all of these different kind of puzzles, and you have to figure out the puzzle. If you got everything right on this first page, you were allowed to move to the second page. If you got all of these right, you were said to have quote-unquote average IQ. As you'll notice, most of these are sayings or phrases that were used in the 1950s, things that we don't even really talk about anymore. What I'd like you to do is go in the folder for this week, go through these and see how many you can get, and then I've also included the answer sheet for you to reference to check your work. What you'll notice about these is that it really depends on the time that you are taking the test to see if it's a valid test or not. Because these are sayings from the 1950s, most of us today in 2020 don't even recognize or maybe have never even heard of some of these sayings. That lets us know that this is not a valid test of intelligence testing in our day today. What is intelligence? Intelligence is the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use our knowledge to adapt to new situations. People often have a different concept of what it means to be smart, and we're going to be talking about all different types of intelligence. Regular book smarts, as most people would say, is a very different thing than people who are very common sense smart or street smart, if you will. There are other people who are also really good at what we call emotional intelligence. All of these different types of intelligence help people to live their lives every single day, interacting with other people, solving problems. I know for a fact that I have several friends who have PhDs, who are very, very intelligent people, meaning that they're very book smart, they've done good on all kinds of standardized testing. But some of these people that I know that are very smart in that way are not good at all at relating to people. They don't have a lick of common sense, right? So intelligence can mean a lot of different things depending on the context of which you're speaking. Raymond Cattell was one of the first psychologists who really tried to categorize different types of intelligences. Cattell said that fluid intelligence is intelligence that reflects the ability to process information, particularly in novel or complex circumstances. Now, if you remember from Chapter 4, which was our development chapter, we talked about fluid intelligence, and we said that this definitely declines with age as we age normally as human beings. That's why sometimes older people have difficulty in multitasking, in processing information from their environment, and taking that in and being able to adapt to those changes. Crystallized intelligence is intelligence that reflects both the knowledge a person acquires through experience and the ability to use that knowledge. As we said in Chapter 4, crystallized intelligence usually does not decline with age. We said if you are a really great artist and you could draw really well when you were 25, if you still have the physical ability to do that when you're 85, you should be able to do that just as well as you did when you were 25. Howard Gardner is credited with the theory of multiple intelligences, the idea that people have many different types of intelligence that are independent of one another. And he was really the first person to come up with this idea that we all have different strengths and weaknesses in how we relate to our environment and how we relate to each other. Body kinesthetic, linguistic, mathematical, logical, spatial, musical, and interpersonal intelligence. Robert Sternberg came up with the triarctic theory, the idea that people have three types of intelligence: analytical, creative, and practical. And of all the different types of theories, Sternberg is the one that in clinical psychology we tend to follow the most, especially in psychological assessment. Analytical intelligence is similar to that measured by standard intelligence tests like the Stanford-Binet or the WAIS that we'll discuss. Creative intelligence involves the ability to gain insight and solve novel problems, and practical intelligence refers to dealing with everyday tasks. Practical intelligence is really what most people would consider to be street smarts or common sense. When we talk about creativity, as Sternberg did, we can divide that into two different types of thinking. Creativity is divided into convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Convergent thinking is a left-brained activity involving zeroing in on a single correct answer. Many of you have probably taken a left brain, right brain personality test, and we will talk about those when we get to our chapter on personality. But people who are left brain tend to be more analytical. They tend to be people who are typically good in science and math. They're good at looking at a problem and coming up with one best answer for that. However, Sternberg, in his creative intelligence, really looks at divergent thinking, and that's the ability to generate new ideas, new actions, and multiple options and answers. People who are more divergent thinkers tend to be more right-brained thinkers. They are people who are better at writing and music and art, and they tend to be more out-of-the-box kind of thinkers. Now, most of us, and we'll talk about this in that personality chapter, tend to be somewhere in the middle between left brain and right brain, between convergent thinking and divergent thinking. But there are probably some of you who know for a fact you are much more of a convergent thinker with your left brain type of cognitions, and some of you are definitely more divergent thinkers, much more right-brained thinkers. Emotional intelligence, or EI, is the newest concept of our thinking about intelligence. There are four abilities of emotional intelligence: managing your own emotions, using your emotions to guide your thoughts and your actions, recognizing other people's emotions, and understanding emotional language. Now, I'm posting a video in our video folder this week about emotional intelligence, and the woman in the TED Talk really does a great job of explaining emotional intelligence and how you can improve your emotional intelligence. A lot of you graduating from college are going to be getting into your careers and going for that first big job interview. And knowing and being aware of your emotional intelligence can really give you a leg up on other people. Realizing how you convey your emotions to other people, how you can manage those emotions, and how you can read other people's emotions in those types of relationships. So the more you can learn about your own emotional intelligence, the better off you'll be. So make sure to check out that video in the video folder. Daniel Goleman is a psychologist that works in the realm of emotional intelligence, and he's really interested in leadership performance and what makes people good leaders. He works a lot with industrial organizational psychology in helping companies to find people who would be good managers, good directors, good CEOs, people who are good with relating with other people. So Goleman looked at competencies and skills that drive leadership performance, such as self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management, especially in the workplace. A lot of Goleman's research is based upon Walter Mischel's kind of groundbreaking experiments with the marshmallow test. Many of you have probably heard of the marshmallow test, but it was developed by Walter Mischel to look at people's ability to do two things. Number one, delay gratification, and two, to resist impulse. In this experiment, which I have a video coming up for you, Walter Mischel used little kids that were in his own children's preschool. He started out with kids who were between the ages of 4 and 7. And what he would do with these little kids is he would set them in a room with some kind of treat. Sometimes it was a marshmallow, sometimes it was a candy, sometimes it was a cookie, whatever it was. He would sit these kids in a room and he would say, "Here is a marshmallow. It's yours. You can eat it if you want. However, if you wait until I come back in the room to eat the marshmallow, you don't eat the marshmallow until I come back, I'll give you another marshmallow. That way you'll have 2 marshmallows, right?" He looked at these kids and he followed them throughout their elementary, middle school, high school, and even beyond to see what would happen to the kids who were able to delay gratification, to resist that impulse to eat the marshmallow, or those kids who ate the marshmallow right away. And what he found was pretty interesting. He found that the kids who delayed gratification, who did not eat the marshmallow, who waited the entire time to get the second marshmallow, tended to be kids who did better in school. They tended to be kids who got into better colleges, who were less likely to use drugs and alcohol. As adults, they were less likely to get divorced. They made more money. When he looked at the other group, the kids who ate the marshmallow right away, these were kids who didn't do as well as in school. They were more likely to get into fights and to get in trouble in school. They didn't get as good grades. A lot of them dropped out of school. They had a lesser rate of going into college, and they had a more likely chance of getting messed up with drugs and alcohol, and were more likely to get divorced as adults. So it was a very long-term study that he followed these children. This test has been done over and over and over many, many times in psychology to watch the results, and we do see very, very similar outcomes to that. All of this relates back to emotional intelligence, and it goes with this idea that the more self-aware you are, the ability to delay that gratification, to resist impulses, the more successful that you'll be overall. Unfortunately, I'm having some technical issues getting the video to play in this audio PowerPoint, so I've included it in our video folder for this week. Please make sure that you watch the marshmallow test. It's a great example of Mitchell's research. Some of the kids, they're all very cute. Some of the kids will eat that marshmallow right away, but the majority of them wait until the very end, once the experimenter comes back in the room, to eat the marshmallow, therefore getting the second marshmallow. This would be a great example of Mitchell's research in showing that they have delayed gratification, they're resisting those impulses, which Mitchell would say would benefit them later on in their adult life. Now I want to talk a little bit about intelligence assessment. Intelligence can't be measured directly. We have to evaluate it and study it by looking at the acts and the behaviors and how people generate their intelligence. Intelligence testing is a method for assessing an individual's mental aptitudes and comparing them with others using numerical scores. Individual differences here are key for us. We want to look at how a person scores on some kind of task, and then we want to be able to compare those scores with other people who are the same age. A psychometrist or a psychometrician is a person who specializes in psychological testing and assessment. I'll tell you that one of my favorite jobs that I've ever had is being a psychometrician. I've done lots of intelligence testing, personality testing, developmental testing, clinical assessments, all different types. But the intelligence testing is a lot of fun because you're in a room with a person, you're doing all of these different kinds of tasks and games to see how they can perform on those tasks. To be a good assessment of any psychological construct, whether it be intelligence or personality or developmental aspects, every single type of assessment has to have good test construction. For a psychological test to be acceptable, it must fulfill the following 3 criteria: standardization, reliability, and validity. Standardization. Standardizing a test involves administering the test to a representative sample of future test takers in order to establish a basis for meaningful comparison. So we want to be able to compare the scores of the people who take the test with a group that is similar to them. Standardization also involves having what we call uniform procedures. Whenever we administer the test or score a test, we want to make sure that it's fair for everyone, that everyone has the same chance to succeed. So just like if you take the SAT or the ACT, the instructions that you get are read verbatim by the person who's in charge to make sure that everyone has the same instructions. They are given the same amount of time for the test. They are given the same materials for the test. So we want to make sure that it's fair for every single person that takes the test. Reliability. A test is reliable when it yields consistent results. Always remember, reliability equals consistency. To establish reliability, researchers establish different procedures. We have all different kinds of reliability. We want to make sure that this test is reproducible so that the same person, if they take the same test over and over, if there's nothing else that changes, they should get a similar score. We have all different kinds of reliability, like test-retest reliability when someone takes the same test. We have split half reliability where someone takes one half of the test, maybe numbers 1 through 25, and then they take numbers 26 through 50. Or maybe they do all the evens and then all the odds. Their scores should be consistent to be reliable. The last type of test construction is validity. While a test might be reliable, it doesn't mean that it's valid. Validity of a test refers to what the test is supposed to measure or predict. So we want to make sure that if I'm giving you a test on general psychology, I'm not asking you questions that have to do with sociology. Even within this class, if I give you exam 2 and it's supposed to cover memory and intelligence, there aren't questions on there about personality or psychological disorders. So in order for a test to be valid, it has to measure what it is supposed to measure or predict. Within this realm of test construction, we need to talk a little bit about aptitude versus achievement tests. We do both of these kinds of testing in psychology. Aptitude tests are designed to predict future performances, like the SAT, right? The Scholastic Aptitude Test. It takes your knowledge that you have now and it says how well or what is the potential of this person to perform in the future. An achievement test is really what you take in this class. Achievement tests are designed to measure current knowledge. So after we cover this chapter and you take the next exam, that will be an achievement test of your current knowledge up to that point. Let's talk now a little bit about the history of intelligence assessment. Sir Francis Galton was actually a mathematician, a statistician in the late 1800s, early 1900s, who is credited for developing the first mental test that we ever had. However, Galton's ideas about what a mental test was is very different than what we consider intelligence assessment now. He was looking at things like hand grip strength, breathing capacity, visual acuity, memory for visual forms, and most importantly, head circumference, the size of someone's actual head. I can tell you I know several friends who are pretty big guys, 6'5", 6'6", who have really big heads, and they are definitely not the smartest people that I know. We know that the size of someone's actual head has nothing to do with how smart they are. But Galton is credited for developing the first mental test, which is really the beginning of intelligence assessment. While Galton is credited with developing the first mental tests, Alfred Binet developed the original intelligence test in 1904, and this is the test that was really the basis for building what we consider to be intellectual assessment today. Binet was tasked with helping out the French school system to group children together based on their abilities. He was looking at their ages and then comparing them based on how they would score on certain types of tests. Louis Terman took this idea of Alfred Binet, brought it to the United States, and developed the Stanford Binet, which is an intelligence test that is still used today. We're going to talk a little bit today about the David Wechsler assessments. Wechsler developed the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale in 1939. It's the first test for use with adults and measures two factors of intelligence, verbal IQ and performance IQ. When people say IQ, they're not talking about intelligence in general. They're not talking about the assessment. IQ really stands for an intelligence quotient. It's based on the concept of Alfred Binet called mental age. Mental age is an assessment of a person's intellectual standing compared with that of same-aged peers. And there is a mathematical equation that they used to use. We don't really use this exactly anymore, but they used to use this equation in order to figure out the intelligence quotient. IQ equals mental age divided by chronological age times 100. That's the mathematical equation for figuring out the intelligence quotient. Now remember, intelligence quotient, IQ, is not really what we consider to be the concept of intelligence. When we're talking about a mental age, it's how a person scores on a test relative to people of different ages. Chronological age is how old you actually are. So if you have a child who is 10 years, 5 months old, that's their chronological age. If that child scores on a test the same as children who are 5 years old, their mental age would be 5 years old. Their chronological age would be 10 years, 5 months. You would do the math and then times 100. If your chronological age is the same as your mental age, for example, if you are 21 years, 2 months old, and your mental age is also 21 years, 2 months old, 21.2 over 21.2 is 1 times 100, your IQ would be 100. All of the intellectual assessments that we use today are based on a normal curve, or what we call a bell-shaped curve. We're going to talk today about the Wechsler tests, and the Wechsler, as well as the Sanford-Binet, are based on this normal distribution. So, like I said, if your mental age is the same as your chronological age, that would be 1 times 100. Your IQ would be 100. And as you can see on this chart, right down the center is an IQ of 100. 68% of the general population of adults in the United States will score between 1 standard deviation above or 1 standard deviation below that mean of 100. So in this case, a standard deviation is 15 points. 68% of the general population of adults will score between 85 and 115. 95% of people will fall within 2 standard deviations or 30 points of that median score of 100. So between 100 and 130 or 170. If 100 is the mean, an IQ between 100 and 115 would be average IQ. Between 115 and 130 would be high average IQ. An IQ between 100 and 85 would be average IQ, and an IQ between 85 and 70 would be a low average IQ. If that takes up 95% of the general population, you have a very small percentage on either end of that scale between those numbers. Only about 2.5% of people in the United States who are adults have an IQ over 130, and about 2.5% of the general population have an IQ of 70 or below. If a person has an IQ of 70 or below, we call that an intellectual disability or a cognitive disability. The majority of people who have an intellectual disability in the United States, it's about 85% of people who have an intellectual disability will have a mild cognitive disability, and that's an IQ between 50 and 70. Their adaptations to the demands of life, they may learn academic skills up to a 6th grade level, they might need assistance, they might need some help with social or vocational skills. If someone has an intellectual disability between 35 and 50, that's considered a moderate intellectual disability. And then you have severe and profound. When you're talking in the severe and profound range, an IQ really between 35 and below, it's very challenging to assess intelligence at that level. A lot of people are nonverbal and they really have a difficulty in responding and even understanding some of the prompts that you use. So if you were to ask what IQ distinguishes a cognitive or intellectual disability, it's an IQ of 70 or below. Let's talk a little bit about the Wechsler scales. David Wechsler has created quite a few different intelligence scales that are used in the United States for all different age groups. There is the WIPSI, which is used for preschool and primary age children. There's the WISC, which is used for school-age children. And then there is the WAIS, which I mentioned before, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, which is used for people from the age of 16 all the way up to the age of 90. The WAIS is a great instrument in that it gives us not only a singular IQ score, but it also gives us scores on different indexes and different subtests that let us look at the relative strengths and weaknesses that an individual might have. We're currently in the 4th edition of the WAIS, and it is a test that, as I mentioned before, is used widely clinically in the United States. The WAIS scales group questions into what we call subtests, each of which measures a different intellectual task. These scales are thus designed to offer insight into a respondent's relative strengths and weaknesses and not simply yield one overall IQ score. So you're really getting a good picture of what the person is good at and maybe some of the weaknesses that they might have as well so that you can help them out with that. The WAIS scales include subtests that measure a wide range of abilities. The WAIS yields several important scores. Clinically, we're interested in two main things. The first is called the full scale IQ, or sometimes you're going to see it as FSIQ. And that is combined performance from all of the subtests, which we'll talk about in just a second. There's also the GAI, which is called the General Ability Index. And the General Ability Index looks at 6 very specific subtests that are less vulnerable to different types of impairment that some people might have problems with. So it's a shorter version of looking at things like vocabulary. We're going to talk about similarities, block design, 6 different ones that give us just a different look at, again, strengths and weaknesses. If we really want a detailed examination of a person's abilities, we compute these separate, what we call index scores that help us to measure the main components of intelligence. And we'll talk about those in just a second. Within that full scale IQ and those 4 separate index scores, there are 10 core subtests that make up the indexes that give you that IQ score. We look again at how someone is performing in relation to their similar aged peers, and that gives us scaled scores on these subtests, and that helps us to compute full-scale IQ. There are also 5 supplemental subtests that you can sometimes give, but really there are 10 core subtests that we use. These IQ scores are based on how respondents' answers deviate from those attained by people of the same age. The mean whole test score at any age is defined as 100, which we talked about before on that graph that I showed you. Wechsler distributed IQ scores says the majority of the scores of the populations would lie within a broad average range of 85 to 115. As I mentioned before, that's 1 standard deviation above and 1 standard deviation below the mean of 100, so 15 points above and 15 points below. In a normal distribution, that's 68% of the IQ scores. Once again, general intellectual abilities are summarized with the computation of 2 broad IQ scores, as I mentioned before, the full scale IQ or the FSIQ, and that is looking at the combined performance from all of the subtests, and then also that GAI or General Ability Index, which is only looking at 6 very specific subtests. I mentioned the different indexes that we looked at, and these are how we group those subtests based on really what they're measuring. And the 4 index scores on the WAIS are the VCI, which is the Verbal Comprehension Index, the PRI, which is the Perceptual Reasoning Index, the WMI, Working Memory Index, and then the PSI, which is Processing Speed Index. What's interesting is when you give a WAIS, when you look at scores on a WAIS, you can see that people generally have strengths in one certain area. So maybe they're really, really good in verbal comprehension, but maybe they have weaknesses in processing speed or working memory. So in giving these different subtests, you can see where the strengths and weaknesses lie, and they're usually within one of these index scores. Now let's take a look at those indexes and the subtests of the WAIS. Remember, there are 4 indexes and there are 10 core subtests within the WAIS. The first index is the VCI, the Verbal Comprehension Index, and that contains 3 subtests: similarities, vocabulary, and information. Similarities is an interesting subtest. It looks at how 2 things are alike. The question might be like, how is an orange similar to an apple? You would say they're both fruits, or you can eat both of those things. The vocabulary subtest is an interesting one in that it is the subtest that is used if you cannot perform an entire WAIS. Entire WAIS takes a really long time. It's very expensive to give an entire WAIS, especially if your insurance doesn't cover it, but mainly it takes a really long time. If a clinician or psychologist has questions about someone's intellectual ability or disability, sometimes they'll initially just give the vocabulary subtest to get an idea of what their IQ is. The reason for that is that vocabulary has the highest correlation. Remember, we talked about correlation, the highest correlation with full-scale IQ. So generally, if someone does very, very well on the vocabulary subtest, we can infer that their IQ might be on the higher side. Similarly, if they have a very, very low vocabulary score, we might want to, or that might warrant us finding the time or the resources to give someone a full WAIS so that we can measure their IQ if it's in question, if it might be below that 70 range. You might see that question on a test. What subtest of the WAIS is sometimes given because it has the highest correlation with full-scale IQ? Your answer would be the vocabulary subtest. Information in the VCI is also an interesting one. It asks questions like, on what date do we celebrate Independence Day in the United States? Something like that. The PRI, perceptual reasoning, it contains one of my favorite subtests, and that's the block design. You might have seen that on that very first slide when we talked about the WAIS. There are 9 blocks that are colored. Some sides are red, some sides are white, and some sides are red and white. And you're shown a picture of what the top of those blocks might look like in a certain design, and you're timed and you have to recreate that design. You also have visual puzzles where you have to put certain puzzles together. Working Memory Index, or WMI, contains digit span, which is where the psychologist will repeat numbers to you and you have to repeat them back. For example, I might say, please repeat these numbers back to me. 5, 7, 1, 2. And you would have to say 5, 7, 1, 2. And you do them forwards as well as backwards. The arithmetic subtest is basically word math problems that are, again, start very simple and get much more difficult. For example, if you have $1 and lollipops cost 25 cents, how many lollipops could you buy? Something like that. And then the last one, of course, is the processing speed index, which contains symbol search and coding. All of these subtests together help us to get very detailed pictures of someone's intelligence level. Not only within each index do we get strengths and weaknesses within verbal comprehension or processing speed, but we can combine all of the scaled subtests, again, comparing someone's score to people their same age, to get an idea of full-scale IQ. So we're looking at full-scale IQ with everything together, combined performance from all of the subtests, and then we're also getting that GAI, the General Ability Index, which is looking at 6 very specific subtests.